Welcome to Love for the Truth Radio, a program devoted to encouraging you to be a contender of the faith in an ever-changing church culture. On Love for the Truth Radio, we will discuss current issues and challenging views along with biblical truth that can affect our Christian worldview and how we live out our faith. And now, here's your host, Cindy Hartline.
Welcome to the program. Our topic is on the movie Gosenll, America's biggest serial killer. Whether you have already seen this movie or desire to see it, our program will brief you on the true story of Dr. Kermit Gosnell and hopefully enlighten you about the story's message. The truth behind the scenes, as well as the origins of how our culture has played a part in promoting America's biggest serial killer. Apparently, this movie is one of the most controversial movies of our time. Though its focus and case is about the murders Gosnell performed, it sheds light on the reality of abortion and where the acceptance of it may lead. That's why we are covering this movie today. An article from Any News Now reads, even though Gosnell was a smash hit and one of America's top 10 grossing films, I believe it was 2 weekends ago, making more than $1.2 million on just 668 screens. The pro-life movie, as they call it, about a notorious abortionist, Gosenll, the trial of America's biggest serial killer, was dropped by nearly a third of its theaters nationwide this weekend. That's 28% of theaters that axed the Gosenll movie, even though it's a hit. Despite the solid performance for an independent film of this sort, nearly 200 theaters have inexplicably dropped the film, including those in major cities where it was performing the strongest. The Daily Wire, DW, announced, coming into its second week, that was almost a week ago, Gosenll has dropped from 668 theaters to 480 theaters, a full 188 theater drop, 15 of which were top-performing multiplexes. So if you haven't heard about it, that's why. But we will do our best to share our thoughts with you. Our guest to share his thoughts is David Fiorazo, who I believe is an excellent researcher and writer on cultural issues. David Fiorazo is a ministry founder, radio and TV host, conference speaker, and author of 3 amazing books. He's my favorite author of Redefining Truth, Delusions of Replacing God and Calling Evil Good, The Cost of Our Silence, Consequences of Christians Taking the Path of Least Resistance, and Eradicate, Blotting Out God in America, Understanding, Combating, and Overcoming the Anti-Christian Agenda and Apathy in the Church and the Decline of Morality in the Culture. David, again, is one of my favorites. He's an amazing researcher. We'll share with you how to get a hold of those books that are chock full of info and wisdom on our culture today. Welcome, David Fiorazo. It's a pleasure to have you on Love for the Truth Radio again.
Great to be back with you again, Cindy.
You know, David, I'm so excited to talk about this movie. We know that it's very controversial, but I hope that we can enlighten our listeners to what it's really about. You know, Gosenll is the shocking true story of the investigation and trial of Dr. Kermit Gosnell. That's where we get the name of the movie. His 30-year killing spree and the political media establishment that tried to cover it up. That's what it's about. Originally investigated for illegal prescription drug sales, a raid by the DEA, FBI, and local law enforcement revealed crimes they could not have expected within the clinic. And that's how it starts out, you know. And David, I know that you've seen the movie. I've seen the movie. It was an eye-opener for me. I literally wanted to weep, just cry through the whole entire thing now. We also know that the movie is based on the New York Times bestseller. It was a book. I didn't know that until later on. And it also is the untold story of America's most prolific serial killer. So, David, I want to paint a picture of the movie in the minds of our listeners who have not or will not see the movie, Gosenll. I believe it was a very well-scripted movie that clearly got the message across of the atrocities of abortion without showing blatant, eerie images, thank God. But what was your take on the movie?
It was absolutely well done, very professional. And I do want to say that disclaimer up front that It is really a crime story. The information they got from the actual FBI investigation, from the trial, the court case transcripts,
yes,
and from other eyewitnesses and interviews, that's what the script for this movie was built on. So you're not going to see anything like an abortion procedure. It is verbally descriptive, but not physically. You can't see anything. It's not graphic like you might think. It is a true crime story because he did this for 3 decades, Cindy, and I know we'll get into some of the details of it, but it's based on all these legal documents, FBI investigation and their documents, and the facts, they're almost unbelievable. And one point I also want to make right up front, this is not the only abortion clinic like that in the country.
Right.
Maybe they weren't all as filthy as his was, and we'll talk about that in a minute. They did a phenomenal job portraying that in the movie. But there are many, many more across the country. And these men, and some women, but these men, honestly, he didn't think he was guilty of anything. These men think they're doing a service for women.
Yes.
And there are even some so far deceived as they proclaim to be Christian, and they think they're doing God a service by helping the most vulnerable women. But what about the most vulnerable in the womb? Are those not human lives? And that's where I'd like to start off with by just quoting a scripture or two to give us a biblical foundation here. Old Testament, Jeremiah chapter 1,
yes,
verses 4 and 5. Now the word of the Lord came to me, Jeremiah says, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you.
Yes.
And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. That's one from the Old Testament from Jeremiah. Now, let's go over to a verse that we're all very, very familiar with around Christmas time, and the Gospel of Luke.
Yes.
Luke 1, 15 through 17, it says, he will be great, talking about Jesus. He will be great before the Lord. He must not drink any wine, and he must not drink any wine or strong drink. He will be filled with the Holy Spirit, even from his mother's womb. He will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord. And now, let's jump to Matthew 1, 20 and 21. Still about Jesus and how Joseph, or the angel, appeared to Mary. Quote, but he considered these things, as he considered these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife, for that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit, and then she will bear a son. One more, Cindy, I'm sorry. I've got
go ahead.
The most important ones. I want to share this.
Yes. From
Luke 1:44, and let me be the first to wish you and our listeners here that are tuning in a Merry Christmas. Luke 1:44 says, this is when Mary went to visit her cousin Elizabeth, who was also pregnant with John the Baptist. Luke 1:44, when the sound of your greeting reached my ears, Elizabeth said, the baby in my womb leaped for joy. So what does this teach? First of all, this teaches that a baby, it's not a baby. They didn't call it a fetus in the womb, a clump of tissue. There's these cells, this substance in my womb. It said the baby in my womb leaped for joy. So a baby, we know now with modern technology and science and study that a baby in the womb can feel pain. And forgive me, I forget the actual amount of, I think it's, I'm not even going to guess. After a certain number of weeks, the heart starts beating at about 8 weeks, but they can feel pain after a certain amount of weeks. So look at this, the baby in my womb leaped for joy. These are just some of the many scriptures that support God's heart for life.
Yes, and that is his heart. But I do want to say, David, is that this movie, he was trying not on the basis of the many thousands and thousands of abortions that he performed over those 30 years. This was based on a full baby being born and born alive that he murdered. And that was what the case was based on. And of course, one of the mothers, right? It was 3 babies and a mother that died from the procedure as well.
Yes. There was at least one woman killed.
Yes.
There were some other court cases, but he fled to, I don't remember, some other country, the Bahamas or something, and he stayed there for a while they were doing an investigation.
Yeah.
He got away with, a lot of women were going to the emergency rooms. he had this new abortion procedure, but that's for another time. That wasn't what this movie was based on.
Yes.
He delivered in this movie. They were researching at least 8 babies that were born alive. Now he did this for how many decades? Almost 30 years.
Yes.
So can you imagine how many babies?
No, I can't.
And we're saying babies that were born. How were they born, you say? Well, some of these women came in, some of these young girls, they were at 6 months, 8 months, and you were still allowed to have an abortion, right?
Yeah.
Well, one of the things they did, one of the drugs they gave these women was to speed up that process, to what do you call it? To induce induce labor. So it speeds up the process, and sometimes the babies would come out before he was actually able to abort them. And what he called it fetal demise. The women came in for an abortion. He wanted to ensure fetal demise. That means killing the baby. So they were born, and so they were born alive. But what he did then is he snipped the necks or the spinal cord with scissors. That's how he killed them.
Yes,
so
he did.
This went on. There were infant parts in freezers in the Gosenll clinic, in the refrigerators and the freezers. He kept baby feet in jars.
Yes. Yeah.
For what he called research.
The DNA.
And you're thinking, people hearing this have a hard time understanding how. First of all, it just sounds wicked, and it is.
It is.
It's child sacrifice.
Yes, it is.
Where does this? How can someone like that get away with this? Well, here's what happened: the Democrats in Pennsylvania protected him. They did not inspect his clinic for 17 years.
Right. Yeah.
Now, the acting in the movie I thought was phenomenal. They did a really good job. Here's how it starts out. They end up going to the clinic based on a drug issue. The FDA went in there, the Food and Drug Administration, and the FBI.
Yes.
They went in. It wasn't an abortion issue to start with. It wasn't a murder case. It wasn't a murder trial. They were going in because they were selling Gosnell and his clinic workers, who some were teenagers.
Yes.
They were selling illegal prescriptions.
Yep.
And I believe for cash. How can you be a millionaire without it? But anyway, and there's no records, right? Or very few records.
Right.
So they were selling these prescriptions to women. They were using the IDs of homeless people to go in and get prescriptions, and then they'd sell them to these women that would come into the clinic for drugs. Now, the clinic workers, some of them teenagers, they were underage. They had no training, no medical training. There were no nurses. No. He trained them on how to administer anesthesia. In fact, that's how one woman died.
Yes.
And he trained them on how to, help speed up the delivery process, induce labor. He trained them. A 14-year-old was in there learning how to do this. So this was absolutely astounding, Cindy. I know I want to give you time to give your thoughts, let your thoughts out too.
Yeah, no, this is good stuff. You know what was amazing? What I understood was that in Pennsylvania at the time, that women were allowed to get an abortion before 24 weeks. After, because I know each state has their own laws, okay? But I know that if it was over 24 weeks, Gosenll believed that he was doing justice because these women needed him because they desired the abortion, and he was giving them what they needed. But anyway, we're going on a break already, David. So we'll be right back. Please stay tuned. We'll be talking about the Gosenll movie and the response of the media and a lot more information.
You're listening to Love for the Truth Radio. We'll be right back, so please stay tuned.
If you're a first-time listener, you'll find that on Love for the Truth Radio, we discuss news and views from a biblical worldview. We believe that the Bible is the inerrant Word of God and the absolute truth that should be applied to every aspect of life. We don't proclaim to have a cap on the truth, but we do have a love for biblical truth. So please, take everything you hear on this radio program to study and prayer, And thank you for listening to Love for the Truth Radio.
Welcome back. I'm Cindy Hartline, your host for Love for the Truth Radio, where we try to get out the truth to you and what's going on in our culture. With us is David Fiorazo, my favorite author. We're talking about the Gosenll movie and how many theaters have axed the movie because they believe it has a pro-life context. So we want to get this to you. If you haven't seen the movie, we want to get as much information to you. Personally, David, I thought the movie was excellent in acting. The person, and if you love movies, you got to see it. The man that played Gosenll, in fact, I forget his name. He was so good that it was hard to believe it wasn't him. And I've had an acting background, David. I know you have had an acting background. I don't know if you learned about that inward chemistry, that you should be able to see one thing on the outside, but know what the person is thinking on the in. And he did an excellent job, I thought, on that. You knew what the guy was thinking with a smirk, So.
Yeah, I thought they did a phenomenal job with the writing of the script, first of all. The acting was very well done. It was produced well. It wasn't in your face as far as any kind of agenda or political agenda or anything else. It was telling a story about this serial killer that went on a 30-year killing spree. And what comes into it a little later on, once it gets to the trial, and I don't want to give it away, but the political and media establishment that tried to cover it up. Two of the main reasons, you mentioned this before we got on the air here for the interview, you said two of the main reasons I think that people don't know about it, and you were asking people and they hadn't heard about it.
Right.
First, a complicit media covered it up at the time.
Yes.
And this was, I think, 5 years ago or less. Also, America has unfortunately become so apathetic about this battle over life. And here's one thing I want to put out there. Every year there's a massive march for life in Washington, D.C. One year there were 400,000, almost 500,000 people marching.
Yeah.
Young people, old people marching for life. The media doesn't cover that. Okay, you get 12 pro-choice protesters or activists somewhere else. The media will be all over that. But 400, 500,000 pro-life, no. So I'm thinking if those people, or if some of us who are a little bit more engaged and active, the media is not covering it, why don't we start raising awareness in other ways? Now, I'm not saying don't go to March for Life, but the media is not doing their part. And thank God for conservative websites, LifeSite News and others that are talking about it. But has it changed America's view of abortion? Largely no. Maybe some people, but largely no. Has it helped people elect the right people so that we can get Roe v. Wade overturned? No. So this is a law since 1973. So that March for Life happens, and we're talking about media bias here, which is a horrific problem in this country. Back to the Gosenll movie.
Yeah.
It was taken out of theater. Well, first of all, they were just trying to advertise it, Cindy. Facebook, NPR, other outlets, they were having a hard time advertising it. And I've got an article I just printed up today. Facebook actually censored pro-life ads. They had just showed newborn babies or ultrasound photos, and Facebook censored it. So the Susan B. Anthony list was saying, hey, the pro-life movement is being directly targeted by social media groups. So the Gosenll producers, they did do a great job of fundraising for the movie. They also, I'm sure, had a marketing budget, but they could not get it out there. So it was a grassroots effort.
Yeah.
It did very, very well.
Yes, it did.
In the first weekend, it did extremely well in the theaters.
Yes, it did.
And in fact, it hit the top 10.
I was going to say that. It really did. It was. Can you imagine that? And then these theaters would take it down just because that it's talking about the bad word, abortion, But yet it wasn't.
And that word really isn't used a lot.
It wasn't. No, it wasn't. Yeah. Abortion was not used. This was about murders. They murdered these babies when they were born, and that's really what it was about. But you got a really clear bird's eye view of what this his place looked like. It was disgusting. It was not clean. It was, and you know what I thought was really interesting? He had endangered. Now this was crazy. He had endangered turtles in his waiting room, swimming around in the water, and he said it made the woman very calm. And of course, well, I don't want to tell the story, but he was so concerned about those turtles that when they evicted him, he said, "Can I go home, or can somebody feed my turtles?" I mean, think about how crazy that is. I don't know why I just brought that up, but I mean, there's
that's an interesting. Think about this. Think about people, human beings. Some people are more concerned about an endangered species of animal in the animal kingdom, or a fish or a turtle, than they are human babies. I know. And the scriptures, we've got more scriptures coming. Yeah. But we've established that how God feels about life in the womb. It is a baby, and it's a human life that should be protected. And next to preaching the gospel, Cindy, and defending the faith, this is the most important Christian battle in the public arena. So I'm so thankful we're doing this show on this important topic.
Yeah. And you know Michelle Malkin of MRC News Busters, she wrote an article on October 11th basically stating that Gosenll, the trial of America's biggest serial killer, was she felt was the most important movie in America right now, and believed that it would be groundbreaking. It was a true life saga of ground versus evil, deadly medical malpractice, systematic government malfeasance, and cultural apathy toward the most vulnerable members of our society. And of course, we're talking about these little babies. Here she's saying it's groundbreaking, but if the film doesn't get out and people aren't seeing it, how much groundbreaking are we going to have? So we're just asking Christians to stand up for this truth, and be that light.
And people can see that article at the Media Research Center's News Busters. Yeah. And it's called The Most Important Movie You've Never Heard Of. Okay. And I'd love to quote Michelle Malkin a little bit further, Cindy, since you brought her up. I love her writing.
Too.
She's been a patriot and a defender of the truth and factual research. She said, operating under the cover of providing, quote, reproductive health services, Death Doc Gosnell brutally executed hundreds of healthy, living, breathing, squirming, viable babies by stabbing them in their necks and severing spinal cords with scissors and knives. This twisted murderer kept newborn baby feet in specimen jars, which he crammed into the grisly refrigerators of his filthy clinic for, quote, research.
Yes. Oh, my gosh.
And thank you for people like that. They're going to tell it like it is. And again, in the movie, Gosenll, you will not see anything. Actually, they do a good job of revealing what there were garbage bags around the clinic, and they opened up the freezer. There were different colored bags in there. I've got a blog on my website, a recent article I did. It's the actual photo of remains of babies in the freezer in different bags. You can't tell they're babies, but they're bags. The FBI and the police investigated, and they were baby remains, fetal remains in the freezer of this filthy clinic. And one other thing that was a major issue with them, and then they went to see it. Now, the Pennsylvania Department of Health did nothing to stop Gosenll, and worse, they looked the other way.
They did. Yes.
Here's what they decided in 1993, and this is in the movie, in the transcript. The PA, Department of Health, decided to stop inspecting not only Gosenll's, but all abortion clinics.
I heard that.
Unless there were major complaints, of course, right? But what happened was, think for sanitary reasons, and he had teenagers working there, young women that weren't medically trained. They didn't know how to clean all the instruments, how to sanitize everything. This put countless women at risk of infection, disease, and also, one more thing, they used the tables, they used abortion instruments, and this is going to gross you out, but they used them over and over again, many times, without sanitizing them. Yeah. And the procedure tables not being wiped down or cleaned, what happens then? This is true. Many women contracted STDs from the clinic. And so there was so much going on in just this one Philadelphia abortion clinic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, one more thing.
Sure.
And this is according to the FBI reports and the investigation.
Mm-hmm.
Gosenell saved his very late-term or full-term abortions for Sundays. Why? Only his wife would come into the clinic and assist him, and he destroyed all those files. But we'll never know how many full-term babies he killed over the years. But as Michelle Malkin said, the numbers are just hard to believe. They're up there hundreds.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably into the thousands. But what can be proved or safely estimated is hundreds. And this is just so sad, Cindy, that this was allowed to happen because we've got a media and a culture that kind of shies away from this very important topic of life, and they don't want to talk about the abortion procedure or anything. And it does do a lot of damage to women, and I don't know, we won't have time to get into that, but this is just a horrific thing that happened.
Yes.
True story. And people should go look up the information on it.
Yeah. And you know, David, I was thinking about your article, media bias in your article. You said babies were murdered, women injured, media yawned, and you wrote two of the main reasons you don't really know about convicted murderer Kermit Gosnell are first, a complicit media cover-up by the news, and second, America has become apathetic about the abortion industry. And some of the movie theaters decided not to play the movie because of the controversial views. But what I want to talk about is the silence, especially from churches, Christians. People don't want to talk about this.
I know.
America has become apathetic. And that's, I think, the part that bothers me the most is nobody wants to do anything. And you know, I don't know if you have any more thoughts on that, and then we'll get on to the history of this.
Sure. I mentioned in the last segment, you know, the March for Life.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a wonderful thing. God bless people that go out there in the freezing cold. I think it's in the end of January and March for Life. It's on the anniversary of Roe versus Wade from 1972-73. They do that, but I think one of the things I think Christians, especially who should be the most concerned about this issue, we need to change our approach. If it was legalized, taking the life of innocent children, the most vulnerable in mothers' wombs, was legalized in 1973. What year is this now? Oh, 2018. Have we made any progress there? So we really maybe have elected some people. Maybe we've passed. I know in the last decade or so we've passed some wonderful pro-life laws, and even President Trump has been behind some really good pro-life policy. We haven't done enough, and so that's where the call is for us to raise awareness about this and talk about this important issue.
We'll be right back with David Fiorazo talking about the warped worldview and its origins. So please stay tuned.
Many would agree that we are living in unprecedented times. Grave immorality is on the rise, as in the days of Noah and Sodom and Gomorrah. There are wars and rumors of wars as nations rise against nations. Prophecy is being fulfilled as the birth pangs become quicker and harder. These are the signs of the return of Jesus Christ. There is one sign often left untaught. Jesus also told the disciples in the Olivet Discourse to take heed that no man deceive you. This warning applies to us too. Deception has infiltrated the churches through many false teachings and movements, making apostasy paramount. As contenders of the faith, we do our best to research and discuss these false teachings for you, the listener. Thank you for having a love for the truth.
Welcome back. I'm Cindy Hartline, your host. With us is guest David Fiorazo. He is the author of amazing books, Redefining Truth, Delusions of Replacing God and Calling Evil Good, and The Cost of Our Silence, Consequences of Christians Taking the Path of Least Resistance, which we will be bringing up in this segment, I believe, if not next. Check it out. Look at Amazon, look up David Fiorazo, and get a hold of his books. I'll tell you, he's my most favorite author, and he just has so much information concerning our culture and some of the things that we should be standing up for and even facing and addressing as Christians. David, I want to move on to the warped worldview and its origins. Like, what happened to us as a culture? I mean, you and I'm probably older than you, but I didn't grow up in this America. I grew up, and I know there was sin, always sin, but it was different. You know, it was like people had at least conviction about abortion. They had conviction about living together. They had conviction about gender identity. We've lost that conviction. And a lot of that is because, we talked about it, because of agencies that promote different agendas. And one of them is Planned Parenthood. We will be talking about that. But I want to start with Margaret Sanger's history. You have a wealth of information on her. I know that I read this. I think you sent me the article. I don't know where I got it from, but I believe it was from you, that Margaret's grandson, Alex Sanger, said the whole underpinning of what my grandmother stood for was that everyone should have access to, quote, family planning, the right to decide whether and when to have a child. Now, Sanger's, quote, family planning, I guess, saw it a lot differently than we would, but it was really the promotion of much more than birth control. She believed that government should promote her devious ways through their programs. What do you know about Margaret Sanger's history?
Oh, my goodness. Yeah, I wrote a whole chapter on that in Eradicate.
Oh, and I didn't mention that book. Yeah. David, just for a moment, mention your book real quick. Eradicate. Blotting out.
The first one, Eradicate, Blotting Out God in America.
Yeah.
Now, I wrote the chapter is called Planned Parenthood's Buried History.
Yes.
Margaret Sanger and America's Culture of Death. Alexander Sanger, also in the early 1990s, said, when they were propping up his grandmother, Margaret Sanger said, poor women on the Lower East Side, this was in New York. The first clinic, by the way, was in Harlem. And there's a reason. She went into a minority neighborhood. She wanted to weed out the black population. She was selling it as a service to help them because they couldn't afford babies. But she was a eugenicist and she was a racist. You can look up information on her. She spoke to a women's auxiliary of the Ku Klux Klan in 21. But in the early 1990s, Alexander Sanger said, poor women on the Lower East Side who were having more children than they could afford, and they were desperate to figure out a way not to. Think about that. What about abstinence?
Yeah.
What about self-control?
Yes.
What about Christian principles of love and waiting until you're getting married to have sex? That's not even mentioned. So this is deviant. It's from the it's evil at the core.
Yes.
It's selfish. It's all about me. Have sex. Don't worry about it. And that's one of the things that Planned Parenthood does today. They sell sex, sexual experimentation, promiscuity, and then, of course, if you get pregnant, we can help you with that, right? But I want to quote, first of all, God's view again on life. Psalm 22, 9 and 10.
Yes.
It says, David said, on you I was cast from my birth, and from my mother's womb, you have been my God.
Yes, I love that.
Isaiah said in Isaiah 49, verse 1 and verse 5, the Lord called me from the womb, from the body of my mother. He named me. And now the Lord says, he who formed me from the womb to be his servant. And it goes on. But these are some principles Christians need to grasp and understand. God sees a baby, a human life in the womb.
Yeah. Yes,
okay?
he does.
Now, let's hear what Margaret Sanger has to say. She says, quote, it is a vicious cycle. Ignorance breeds poverty, and poverty breeds ignorance. There's only one cure for both, and that is to stop breeding these things. Stop bringing to birth children whose inheritance cannot be one of health or intelligence. Stop bringing into the world children whose parents cannot provide for them. Herein lies the key to civilization. And this was part of her worldview. And a lot of people don't know that. There's a historian, his name is George Grant. He wrote a book called Killer Angel about Sanger's wholehearted embrace of the eugenics movement. She was the main organizer of the first World Population Conference in Geneva. That was probably in the 1930s, I'm guessing. But she did a lot. And your listeners, if you don't know some of this background, you're going to go, what? The founder of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger?
Yeah.
Well, she was an atheist.
Yes.
She was a eugenicist. She was a socialist. She had friends. She had many lovers, many of whom were eugenicists as well. And it's just some warped history on population control.
Yes.
On weeding out the less fit from society. What do you think Hitler did over in Germany in the 1930s? The Jews, they were looked at as unfit or less fit or a lower status of the human race. Well, Sanger had one of Adolf Hitler's eugenicists. His name is Ernst Rudin. He wrote for Margaret Sanger in the 1920s in, I believe it was the Birth Control Review. She had, it was a publication at that time. But we're looking over at Germany and Hitler in the 1930s, especially the early 40s, and going, that's such evil. And it was pure evil. But guess what? We had our own issues going on right here in America, starting in the early 1900s and the 1920s. And Sanger got this birth control movement. She coined the term birth control. And today, Planned Parenthood considers their founder, Margaret Sanger, a hero, even though she had a disregard for the value of human life. And if you're a Christian, like we are, she is directly opposed to God's view on life and what it says in God's word, like Psalm 139, I think it's 16, where it says, my frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together. Your eyes saw my unformed body, and all the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. And it talks about how God knits us together in our mother's womb. Again, that's Psalm 139, 13 through 16.
Yeah, I was going to read that too. It's a beautiful. Yeah, I mean, this is the way that God sees it, people. You know, he sees us before you and I, before we were even born in our mother's womb. And he ordained a plan for every one of us. And we know that it's the enemy's demise to stop any plan that God may have through these precious human beings. You know, David, in your article on Planned Parenthood's buried history in America's culture of death, you write, in America, abortion is killing us, but so is our apathy. Our consciences have been seared, and protecting the innocent is no longer a priority. I'm tongue twisted today. Forgive me. We have been become desensitized to evil, the very evil that has led to life being devalued in the United States. And, you know, then we wonder, how did Gosenll ever get here? You know, how was he able to murder all these people, all these little human beings? Because this is the mindset of our culture. It started back then, where David is talking about Planned Parenthood. That's where it started to manifest, you know. And now we have America's culture of death, as you wrote, and we have become desensitized. And that's why I want to talk about, David, is this especially to death today. You know, speaking about the scriptures, Proverbs 6:16 through 19, the Lord hates hands that shed innocent blood. You know, and this is what has been done. No matter which way you do it, when a baby's neck is cut or whether a baby is pulled from the womb, we are shedding innocent blood at that point.
Yes, we are.
You know?
And let's just make sure we all agree, all your listeners and people who are watching this on YouTube or wherever you're hearing this, that we all agree that there is human life in the womb when someone is pregnant and conceived. That is going to be a human being. Some people call it preborn. It is not just a clump. It's not just tissue that's just laying there dormant. It's life. It's a human life, and dead things don't grow. That's one way we know it's life and it's living. But that's so important that you just said, hands that shed innocent blood. God hates that.
Yeah.
So are these babies, are these infants vulnerable? Are they innocent? Well, today's society looks at this and we ignore the fact that there is an abortion every 26 seconds in America.
Gosh.
And, well, unfortunately, Sanger's worldview, mission accomplished, because Black and Hispanics, those populations are taking the hit. According to the CDC, Center for Disease Control and Prevention, 72% of Black babies are aborted in Mississippi, for example. New York, I believe it's more than half of the babies now, Black babies, are aborted. And do you know who Alveda King is? She's the niece of Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King.
I have heard of her,
pro-life.
Yes.
She's a wonderful pro-life advocate. And she said this, and she's absolutely against what Margaret Sanger started and is and continues her legacy with Planned Parenthood. She said, and she's black, when we said we will no longer sit on the back of the bus, a place was being reserved for us down at the abortion clinic.
Mm-hmm.
And these are things we need to come to terms with. There is an agenda. It started many, many, many decades ago with Margaret Sanger. They're lies. They're perpetrated by the left and people that think that the top thing is self, the top pursuit in life. Whatever you want, if it feels good, do it.
That's right.
They go into they go into public schools and they sell sex. What do you think kids are going to do? I mean, they get their hormones going anyway when teenagers get to a certain age. They're curious, and but if this is being almost forced upon them, what do you think they're going to do? So they're really it's really a hard thing for these kids to come to terms with. They don't know any better, but adults do, and especially Christians, we do. We know better.
Yeah, and we need to speak loud and clear about this because just to say the word abortion, this is a word that no one wants to deal with, David. And we know that if you even say the word, we're going to be taken off of Facebook, YouTube, whatever. Eventually, we know that the theaters didn't even want to deal with this, and it didn't even mention abortion. It was on the little human beings that he murdered, when they were alive. So we know that abortion is a word, let alone an event that no one wants to talk about or deal with. This is what God has to say. And you had mentioned many scriptures. I'm going to say this one again, though, about the prophet Jeremiah. We read the quote in chapter 1, verses 4-5. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you, and I appointed you to be a prophet to the nations. God knew Jeremiah before he was in his mother's womb. On that note, we're going on a break, but we will be back with David Fiorazo. So please stay tuned. There's more to come.
You're listening to Love for the Truth Radio. We'll be right back, so please stay tuned. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, we read that men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, without self-control, fierce, despisers of those that are good, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying the power thereof. From such turn away. They will be ever learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. Thank you for having a love for the truth.
Welcome back. We're in our last segment with David Fiorazo. David, I do want to get right into this because we have a lot to say, and this is our last segment. But I do want to talk about kids being influenced in school today. There is an agenda. And why don't you start?
Yeah, we talked about it a little bit in the last segment, kind of ended with a little bit of that. I wanted to get into detail a little bit more on how Planned Parenthood lobbies to get into the classrooms by, obviously, pro-abortion Democrats. They lobby state legislators in order to mandate this sex ed curriculum. They try to get in under the guise of, get this, safe sex, promoting a worry-free message, right, of sex without consequences.
Oh, geez.
Wasn't that wonderful? Anyway, they talk about treating STDs, and of course, a lot of kids, they're sold on sexual experimentation, so some of them do get STDs, or they think they have a problem. They go in, guess what? Planned Parenthood offers to sell them testing services. So let me just quote this, or just give you this quote. Typically, here's what Planned Parenthood's agenda looks like. It's going to be really brief, couple bullet points. They dupe the public into believing that their main goal is women's health services. They lobby for increased federal funding through American taxpayers. They re-elect pro-abortion Democrat representatives, the money train. They influence public school curriculums with the help of the NEA, National Education Association. They get young kids and teenagers, and of course younger, addicted to sex and encourage experimentation. Then they sell them testing services. They sell them birth control. When kids actually do catch an STD, of course, they have testing services. And when a young girl gets pregnant, they, of course, sell her an abortion. Wash, rinse, repeat. One more thing I want to share with you on information where this is concerned. It just gives us an idea. This is a quote from Ray Comfort. First of all, he was explaining, making a comparison to the Holocaust. He said it's Planned Parenthood abortion. It's legal. It's efficient. It's all done behind closed doors. And he said this, quote, "With the efficiency of a drive-through, they will expedite the killing of your baby for just $765 for up to a 16-week-old child. But the price increases if the baby is over 19 weeks old. You will be shelling out 3 times the amount and paying a whopping $2,165. That's pretty good income for a few minutes of ripping the arms, legs, and head of a baby onto a table, checking the body parts to make sure they're all out, and then putting them in the trash. Sadly, it takes less than 30 minutes for an abortion doctor to complete the task." So the question that I asked several times when I read about this, how on earth did human beings with hearts, souls, consciences, how about Christians, and how in America, this free country, how did we allow this slaughter to reach the level it has reached today? It goes all the way back, I know, to the early 1900s. We talked about Margaret Sanger, but we also have to go back to 1972-73 when we had a major court case, and most everybody knows Roe versus Wade. And I think you wanted to touch on that a little bit, Cindy, didn't you?
Yes, I do, David. Roe versus Wade case in 1971, it was Norma McCorvey, known in court documents as Jane Roe, filed a lawsuit against the Attorney General of Texas, Henry Wade. McCorvey argued a Texas law banning abortion, which had been enforced against her. She believed it was unconstitutional. The Texas law only allowed abortions if necessary to save the woman's life. McCorvey argued the Constitution protected her liberty to choose to have an abortion. And, that's where it kind of all began, right, David? The word liberty.
Yes.
In the Constitution, I believe it's in the 5th and the 14th Amendments, in both places it says that no person can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The 14th Amendment applies to states, and McCorvey argued this limit on state regulation made Texas abortion ban unconstitutional. So this is where abortion began. But it's really interesting. They're talking about the liberty of the mother, but what about the liberty of the child? I guess back then they didn't recognize it. And I don't get it.
Exactly. I want to talk about that for a minute because in one of my books, The Cost of Our Silence, I actually quoted the transcript, parts of the transcript from Roe v. Wade, the court case. And this case has now, of course, led to America's Holocaust. It's a $1 billion industry, one of the least regulated in America, if you call it a, quote, medical procedure, which leads to things like Kermit Gosnell. Fascinating conversations. Now, this was before ultrasound. It was before sonograms. It was before all the technology and the science and the medical knowledge we have today in 1972-73. The woman, I believe she was with the ACLU, Sarah Weddington, I think was her name. They were going back and forth before the pretrial talking about this case, and one of the justices, Justice Stewart, said, "What's involved in this case? Weighing one life against another?" And she said, "No, Your Honor. I say that would be what would be involved. If the facts were different, the state could prove that let me get this clear, make this clear. If the state could prove that there was a person in the womb for constitutional right," and then he said, Justice Stewart said, "Well, if it were established that an unborn fetus is a person with the protection of the 14th Amendment, you would have almost an impossible case here, would you not?" Weddington, the attorney for the pro-choice side, said, "I would have a very difficult case."
Yeah.
So let me just remind you what we just heard. The justice said, if you could prove it's a person, it's going to be a human being, it's a human life, they would have 14th Amendment protections, you would have an impossible case. And she admitted it.
Yeah.
I would have a very difficult case. So this is what is amazing, that in the court transcript, and now if you fast forward to 2018 or 1998, 1988, every decade there's more and more technology showing you what happens in the womb and where the age of a baby and how it was actually 29 days, I think, is when the heartbeat starts. I said something different earlier, but we're learning so much more about human life in the womb. And so now they have no excuses. But guess what? The laws are still in the books. Abortion is still legal. But I'll tell you, in God's view, it is not moral. And that's the problem with this whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It is. David, I think we've also come to a place because of all of this. We have been desensitized of violence, murder, and death. And this is what's happening in our culture right now. We're wondering, why all the violence? What's going on? All the murderers? What about the shootings in school? Well, we've been desensitized. If it's okay, to kill a baby in the womb, then why isn't it okay just to kill? What are your thoughts on that? I know that you had talked about that before a little bit.
Well, you know what that leads to? That leads to what we're seeing today, and that Margaret Sanger was one that would definitely kill off anybody that has any defect in them, including the mentally retarded, someone who's crippled, someone with Down syndrome.
Yeah.
She was quoted as saying she didn't even think they should be allowed to live. Now, this also carries over into the elderly, because now there's euthanasia. Now there's, what do they call it? Compassionate care or mercy killing, whatever they call it.
Yeah.
It's murder. It's taking a life.
Yeah.
And boy, they're so good at being wordsmiths and selling this, because it's, they put it under the guise of dignity, right? Mm-hmm. They ignore the Bible and the what it says about life, the truth. They ignore that, but they say, now it's all about what we want, what's good for society. Well, they don't check with, the Bible, of course, and we can't expect them to. But one thing, it's the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Mm-hmm. Planned Parenthood rakes in billions of dollars. Mm-hmm. They get taxpayer funding over $530-some million a year. That's over $500 million in taxpayer money.
Oh, that's crazy.
Plus, you know how much they get for abortion. The price goes up depending on how late a woman is in her pregnancy, or how far along she is. Mm-hmm. So this is just a horrific thing, and it all comes back to money, doesn't it? And they abort over 330,000 babies a year. That's just Planned Parenthood. That's not the whole abortion industry in America. But these are the numbers. It's staggering when you think about it. But there's a lot of lies behind it, and the deceit is have whatever life you want now and live however way you want, no consequences, right? There's no God, no consequences, no higher authority. Unfortunately, that's some of the thinking behind this. That's the worldview. Yeah,
it is the worldview. And you know what, David, too, I know we didn't talk about this, but it is pushing towards socialism as well, because there's a lot of control over the people. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, Margaret Sanger was a socialist.
She was a socialist,
of course. Yeah. And you bring in more government and more government control. Guess what? The people have less and less and less control until you realize all of a sudden, wait a minute, we're losing our freedom.
Yeah.
And that I'm sure that's for a whole other conversation. But I would encourage people to go look up Margaret Sanger, her Birth Control Review. That was one of her first publications in the 1920s and 30s. What she, my goodness, this is just, there's so much history that people don't know about. One more, I don't know how much time we have. One more, 1932, Sanger got some very prominent blacks to, work with her and to sell abortion to the inner cities so she could fulfill her mission. She was selling it as a service, of course, to people who couldn't afford babies. But she got a guy named Dubois. What was his full name? William Edward Dubois, who said this. I have a quote in front of me from 1932, an essay in one of Margaret Sanger's Birth Control Reviews. He said, he's a black man now. He was with the NAACP when it was getting going. He said, quote, "The mass of ignorant Negroes still breed carelessly and disastrously, so that the increase among Negroes, even more than the increase among whites, is from that part of the population least intelligent and fit and least able to rear their children properly." So he had these men, these prominent black men, businessmen, and people in the community go out and say, we got to get behind what Margaret Sanger is doing, this birth control in the inner cities. And, of course, clinics now today, I believe it's 79% of Planned Parenthood clinics are in minority neighborhoods. That is by design. That is not a coincidence.
It is by design. It's total control, population control, and racism besides the eugenics, and that's exactly where we're headed. You know, with this desensitization of death right now, you know, David, I don't see any difference with having abortion or where the Israelites were sacrificing their children to Baal, you know, as a false worship. I mean, I feel like that's what we're doing in America. We're sacrificing our children to the enemy, to the devil. And I know that might sound very harsh, but that's how I see it. And so when we get that desensitized about our own children, our own babies in our womb, then I believe it does kind of spill over into pedophilia, what we're seeing right now. There's so much of that, and child sacrifice. Anyway, we are going on a break. We can't go there. So we'll have last-minute thoughts on the other side of the break and some advice. So stay tuned.
You're listening to Love for the Truth Radio. We'll be right back, so please stay tuned.
Welcome back. I'm Cindy Hartline, your host for Love for the Truth Radio Philadelphia. Look us up on loveforthetruthradio.com. We air programs via stream every day. You can find program archives with contributors John Haller, Chris Quintana, Carl Tykrib, Patrick Wood, guests like Bill Koenig, Ray Youngin, Johanna Michelson, Bill Salas, and Jan Markell, and many more veterans of the faith with the voice of truth. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, SoundCloud, and on Rapture Ready Radio on Monday evenings on Blog Talk Radio with Jackie Alnor, along with numerous web radio programs who air us on their stations worldwide. David, why don't you finish what you were saying before the break?
Well, sure. Well, you had mentioned, Molech, this god that received child sacrifice in the Old Testament. I believe you can get a reference in 1 Kings chapter 11. And it was just what the people did at that time, thinking they were, I guess, passing through the fire. That was the context. This God they're worshiping, it's Molech. And we have the same thing today in America. In a way, it's child sacrifice. You can put it another way, you can sugarcoat it, but abortion is based in the taking of a life, and it is evil, and we're calling evil good. And you know what Isaiah said in 5:20, I believe, woe, God said, woe to those who call evil good and good evil. So we need to change our approach in America. I think it starts with prayer. I think it starts with we need to be convicted in our hearts as Christians that this is an important issue. And so we need to speak up. Don't be afraid to speak about this, but get informed first.
Yeah. And you know what, David, I'm sure there's a lot of people listening out there, men and women, that have gone through this, women that have had abortions and maybe do feel convicted, and men that knew that their wives did or their girlfriends or whatever have gone through an abortion. And, you know, I'm sure men feel it too. What kind of advice can you give them?
Forgiveness is always available to you. God is waiting for you to turn to him, men and women. Women go through the hardest because they suffer the repercussions and the consequences with the grief, with nightmares, with all the other things that they go through. But men, you're responsible as well if you knew of or even paid for an abortion. So forgiveness, you've got to go to God. He will receive you. We're not judging anybody. We're saying this is wrong. We all sin, but this is something that you've got to go to God and get that straightened out with him. And he is a God of love and compassion, but he does defend the fatherless and the most vulnerable. And he wants us to do the same and speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, and that's life in the womb.
Yeah, amen to that. And David, how can someone contact you, and where are your books available?
Oh, thanks for asking. Amazon.com. A lot of reviews still come in, even from old books, which is nice. DavidFiorazo.com, my website. I'm on Facebook. I've got a few profiles there. Twitter, I've got a YouTube channel, and just growing in different ways. So get a hold of me, go check out some of the materials, some of the articles, and at least read the articles and get updated on what's going on with the battle for life.
Yeah, and if you get a chance, please go out and see the movie. Your heart will be touched.
Yes.
All right. Well, God bless you, David. Thank you so much for your wealth of information. And God bless you, listeners. We'll see you next week.